So hello, everyone. My name is Kemi Sijuwade-Ukadike. I'm the project manager at Eyebeam, where I help the creative technologists and artists that we have in our fellowship Rapid Response. I help them actualize their goals and, sort of like take a look at their plan outside of the artist box and sort of like put their plan into like motion and create milestones and timelines for them. So that's like the job that I do at IB. As Luisa said, rapid response, was sort of created as a response, like, in this age, the social climate that we are in, and also during this age of the pandemic, there were a lot of issues that were at hand that were affecting artists and the work that they were doing. So rapid response was sort of, a call to artists to sort of infuse them, with support and project management support and other types of support, sort of like help them bring their projects forward in this time. With that said, Ari, was one of our fellows, and I'll let Ari introduce herself to you.
Yes. Hi. Great to see you, Kemi. Great to see you all, Luis and Charlene and everyone else. I am Adi Melenciano. My pronouns are she, her. I am a woman with brown skin, currently wearing braids and vertical striped dress. And my work, as Louise mentioned, it engages with a lot of different practices from art and design to pedagogy, and being the founder of Afrotopia, which is an institution that's all about being collaborative and thinking about futures and it from a very interdisciplinary lens. So we have people that are from pretty much every practice all coming together and thinking about what kind of world do we want to live in, especially as Black people in an environment that's healthy and abundant. So excited to talk with Kemi and about what she's been up to at iBeam and the work of Afrotopia and both of our shared and different philosophies.
Cool. So I guess I'll start. 'Cause I have a few questions or just, things that I'd really like to hear more about. And I hope everybody else will enjoy listening to these things. You mentioned earlier that you deal with pedagogy, and that's like the angle that your research practice and the work that you're doing is taking. Why this opposed to just dealing with like social justice issues and, taking that angle?
I think pedagogy for me is it's just been such an exciting place. It's something I grew up with. Like both of my parents are educators, so it just was always a practice I was very familiar with. And I think pedagogy can be an art form within itself. Like you can really, I just think of the most exciting times that I've had within a classroom where I had, passionate teachers or professors that were really excited about their work. They were teaching us skills that would allow us to do whatever we wanted to do, like allow us to just like realize these different dreams that maybe we went into the class not knowing that we were even capable of because we just didn't know what questions to ask in order to figure it out. So for me, it's about, I think the most exciting thing for me in being in a classroom is for one, learning from my students as someone that just like is a constant student of life. I think being in a classroom is just such an easy way to learn from what creatives that are much younger than you, sometimes it might be not that much younger than you, are thinking and doing, but then also just to give people the tools to realize their best selves and realize their best forms of art. So that's why I love being in a classroom. And then as opposed to doing maybe traditional social justice work, I think so much of it starts within a classroom. We can, a lot of people are educated out in the streets or at home or by going to a protest. And I think those are really great tools and necessary. But I think as far as being in tech programs and being in design programs, oftentimes we're not really thinking about race and about socioeconomic status and about social impact. So that for me is a really important space to be in to make sure that people that are going to become the future technologists that are building the tools that we're going to use in, or the people that are going to be designing our cities, that they're inept with and they're well equipped with skills that allow them to understand that, there's not this universality, there's not this whiteness is neutral. There are a lot of different cultures and things that we have to respect and understand about people before we ever even create a single thing.
Wow. Um, and feel free to ask me questions too, but I have quite a few. Um, I noticed that, like, when every time I look at your work, getting back to this pedagogy issue, I see that you have like this extensive booklet. Like I'm so like, how am I gonna read all these books? How has Ari read all these books? Like how do you go about, for us avid readers, like how do you go about like collecting and is there like some kind of like knowledge sharing platform within your network?
Knowledge sharing. I don't know. For me, I practice knowledge sharing because I just think it's so important. Like you never want to be the smartest person in the room, and I think some people kind of strive to be that because it's like it fuels their ego. But then you don't get to learn from what other people are thinking. You don't get their perspective on a book. So for me, it's always about sharing anything that I'm reading. Someone else can have access to it. What are you going to do with that? Like, let's just have a conversation around that. So and I learn from what other people are posting. Like some other people might post a book and I'm like, oh wow, that looks so cool, thank you for sharing that, now I can go read it. So I think knowledge sharing is generally very important. I don't think I have a specific community that practices it intentionally. um, Maybe I do. I don't know if we seek out to do that, but I think just generally it's important for me because it's a collective intelligence that we're fostering when we do that. But my book list makes me anxious too. I'm like, I don't know how I'm going to read all these different books. There's no time to do all of that. But it just excites me because sometimes I'll just like bounce in a single morning between maybe four different books. And I think just the ability to just learn, maybe one day about feng shui and another day about Afrocentric design. I think you just when you're bouncing around different spaces, you kind of pick up on the patterns between them too, and you see similarities. And I think that research practice that I do of just like bouncing around a bunch of different stuff all the time and then synthesizing it into work is just my favorite way of engaging and practicing, because I think we're often kind of stuck in, we're a biologist, so we only need to look at biotechnology and biology related books. But what if a biologist was looking at hair care or physics, and what would they then create? So that's kind of just the way that I practice and enjoy just researching. But what are some books that you've been reading? Like what are spaces that you go to look for things to read? Or
Well, yeah, it's kind of like you. It's kind of organic. I have like my personal things that I read that have nothing to do with technology. Um, that's like so many. I just have like a collection of stuff, But I also have like technology related books. I'm reading like the Black Software.
oh
Um,
yeah, by Charlene. Yeah, I mean,
yeah, like
Charles professor at
yeah.
NYU. Mhm.
Wait, let's see. Black. I'm gonna give you the name exactly. I just kind of like pick up books, and I'm also reading this book about African technology and kind of like where it started.
Oh, cool. You have to
You
share
know,
that.
I'll share that. I'm gonna share
Yeah.
that. I was looking up the link to share it. So those are the books that I've been reading lately. I'm also like really busy and a mom, so I kind of feel like the two books that I'm reading is not enough. But I'm always looking, to sort of like expand, that book list. But I'll share the links to these books after
Yeah.
we speak in case anybody's interested. I don't want to like take away from the talk by looking, you know, by looking for these books. Um, I also like have like another question, and you mentioned it, and it has to do with like I know like you're working on like building up or changing how Afrotextopia has been presented, and all your work sort of like come back, and future work sort of like come back to this whole cultural approach to your creative practice, sort of like and even the way, even like I think like from the books that you've read and mentioned in this conversation, and just knowing you and working with you professionally, I feel like this like the way you're dealing, and the way that you're sort of like structuring, all like the software that you make, it is definitely not structured like with the file sharing Eurocentric type structure. It's like a different structure. And I'd like you to sort of like, speak about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think with Afrotectopia, it's been such a journey and so much learning. And I think a lot of it happens over time and organically, like you learn lessons and then you build on it. So for me, when I first got into building Afrotectopia, I was definitely in a much different political and racially conscious space. Not, I mean, not completely different, but I definitely have a lot more tools than I did back then. And back then it was, I don't think it was on that level that you're saying that it is now of, before it was more of, these are all these forms of oppression that I'm seeing and they're making me really angry and I want to do something about it. I want to like put it in people's face that these are things that we're dealing with. That was what I was doing with my work as a grad student. I was just being extremely traditionally political, in the vein of, you know, making data visualizations or making work all about critical race theory or talking about, you know, appropriation and those sorts of things. And that really exhausted me because I grew up as someone that just wanted to create beautiful things. Like that was really just my goal as an artist, was just to create things that left people feeling excited and in awe. So to bring in race, because it was a time where I was so angry with what was going on, it was it was inspiring in the earlier moments, but then it became exhausting because it just felt like I just didn't have that freedom anymore of just being an artist. I didn't feel like I did. So Afrotectopia was really a space where it was in a similar kind of vein of tech companies. They're extremely white and Asian. Let's do something about it. Tech programs are extremely white and Asian. Let's do something about it. And it was really just like all these people are doing it wrong. Let's show them how to do it right. Or like let's open some doors for us. Let's make sure that we get in the space and their tables. And even that form kind of gets exhausting, and it really, it's paying too much attention to the wrong people. I've realized I don't want to pay attention to what white and Asian people are doing in their companies and systems. And if you want to hire just your own, go ahead and hire just your own. But for me, I really want to pay attention to my own people. Like, what are we doing? What can we build with each other? Like just let's recognize each other and build with one another. And so that's more of the direction that I've taken Afrotectopia in, is not so much challenging all these status quos. I think we're inherently doing that just by existing and being imaginative in the way that we are, and not letting other people define who we are and the way that we should be humans and activists. It's more of, let's just do our own thing and create our own stuff, and look at each other and really focus on each other. So that's been the direction that Afrotopia has taken. And in doing that, it just takes a lot more research as far as, well, who are we? So what have we practiced ancestrally? What were we doing on the continent before all of this was going on? Like, what are our traditions and rituals? Really getting to know ourselves outside of the gaze and outside of other people's definition of who we are. So that's really what turned it into being a lot more of an Afrocentric practice of, for me, going to a lot of panels and being on a lot of different panels. um, it's nice to be able to learn from people, but I think even panels are possibly a Eurocentric design. Like, there are just things that I intuitively feel of, this is too much about individualism and egoism, and it's not enough about community and what do a lot of people have to say. So with the second version, the second festival, Afrotopia, it was about getting away from all the things that are just normal within conferences because they're normal, and really thinking critically about what's the experience of a person going to be like when they're in this space. So there were no panels. There was one fireside chat, and she was met with another speaker, and that was like the closest thing to a panel. But generally, it was communal conversation. So I might bring in a few people that are already doing really great work and just talk about their work quickly, but then open it up so everyone can have a conversation about the work and everyone's voice could be heard. The point of the second festival was really, let's make sure that as many voices as possible are being heard. Because that's where I feel like I learn the most. Like in panels, it's nice to hear people, but I learn so much more when people are standing up and asking questions, and you get to know who's in the room and what are their perspectives and what are the things that they're interested in. I think it's really about that, of like how to make sure that we're doing things not because of the status quo, but because it feels good. And it's a lot of intuition guidance. And I think I'm reading a book right now, actually, that's studying it studies European culture from an African lens, which I think is the coolest thing ever, because anthropology is all about white people going to other cultures and studying them, but to study like the gazers themselves through one of the most oppressive groups of people is really exciting. And it talks about just like, I think one thing that we need to do, and this might be going a little off topic, but we need to do as Black people, is really understand white people, because a lot of the way that we operate is because we're mimicking them, and in ways that we don't even realize at all. So when we understand how are they operating, like who are they, what are like their values, we're really understanding our own values, because we've been trained to carry them as well. And when we can reflect on it, then we're able to sidestep them and object them. So in reading this book, and even just the first few pages, it talks about like intellectualism, which is like this, really a lot of it is in the way that we practice it now, like a European kind of stance is very much intellectualism is basically facts with knowing knowledge, but without the spirituality. Like everything about all the things that we know for sure, what's scientific or all of these things, everything is removed from the spirit and from just like the intuitiveness or the emotion. And so I think in recognizing that, I feel a lot more freeing to be okay with saying I did it because it felt right. Like that, it just, it's something about it made me feel like that was what I was supposed to do. Even though that's not scientific language, I think we really need to honor just the intuition and the feelings that we have. So yeah, I think it's been just a lot of learning, and Aphroditopia is definitely very much changing. The more I learn about the world and the way maybe that is a better way for us to operate and be. So yeah.
Oh, well, that's a lot to take in. And, I also see, like when I asked the question, part of what I wanted to also like find out about, and it's just an extension of what you said, is with like your new mixed reality platform, Utu. Did I pronounce it right?
Hmm.
Like what fascinates me about the platform is that you use multiple forms of media in there. So like there's like if you like move towards a certain area, it's like sound based, and then there are other like like forms of media like all on this platform. And I just kind of like wanted to hear just a bit about like your inspiration for that.
Yeah, actually changed the name. I'm still trying to figure out what's the appropriate name for it. Right now it's Oriaya. And yeah, I think it's similar to what we mentioned earlier. Thank you for all your help as as part of the Eyebeam team, and to Eyebeam for really seeding that opportunity, because it was very much a reflection of what does surveillance capitalism mean? Like, what does Ivan mean by that? And studying that question and thinking about what are the things that I'm thinking about, it really just came from there of surveillance capitalism. I don't think it's the worst thing. I don't think capitalism is the worst thing. I think there are a lot of negative aspects of it. But what I do miss about the days before surveillance capitalism was just that level of spontaneity that you could have when you were on the internet. And I think surveillance capitalism has just done just too great of a job at understanding who we are and what we want to see, that there is really no spontaneous moments when you're navigating the internet. And also thinking about, we're confined into our own homes. Like that's the only place that we can really experience architecture. Maybe we'll go on a walk, especially in like this remote area, in this remote time. Maybe we'll go on a walk and we'll like explore a different part of our neighborhood, but generally we're looking at the same spaces every day. And in traveling, you're exposed to a bunch of different architecture, and you are also exposed to, like, for me, when I travel, I'm always going and just taking a walk around the city, and I'll find like a record shop or a bookstore. And in those spaces, I'm learning about music artists I've never heard of or writers that I've never heard of. So I was just thinking about all three of those things in tandem. And of course, pedagogy and just like my general research practice of bouncing around different books, and wanted to bridge all those different gaps. So what if, even though we're in remote time and we can't travel, I mean, some people are, but I definitely didn't feel comfortable and don't feel comfortable traveling far and going on trips in the same way that I used to. So I wanted to create a space that was thinking about architecture beyond just like this linearly productive tool. So it's about getting from point A to point B. You go into your search engine and you type in something that you want to look for, and then it takes you straight there, or gives you a whole bunch of different options. But instead, what if it could be more of an experience? Like, what if you could move through it and navigate through it like you're navigating through a city, where you, on your way to finding what you want to find, you see another building, you see another store, you stop in a grocery store, like all these different spaces. So not in like that literal way of you'll have grocery stores inside of this online environment, but more of you're going to have these architectural 3D rendered landscapes within a space, and these different forms, as abstract or maybe literal as it may be, are also portals to spaces that are exploring spaces that are exploring subjects that we aren't taught to think of in tandem. So an example might be, what does quantum mechanics have to do with biotechnology, or what does economics have to do with the design of chairs? So just being very kind of like throwing things on the wall, and then just seeing, do you find some sort of similarity, or do you find anything interesting in this union within both subjects, or even just generally being able to be exposed to like just a wide variety of information in one space and just traveling through. So that's been the idea for the project. And now it's in its current form, it's more of me just turning like that book list that I have, or just my general research practice, into a space and making that an embodied kind of experience, as opposed to kind of just like this list of hyperlinks to learn about different things more, but more of like this architectural space that's embodying knowledge. And then the future iterations would be, how can other people contribute their own practice to the space? So you can find about, what does Kemi want to explore within her own space, or someone else, or what does Pharrell want to, what is Pharrell reading on Sundays, and things like that. So it's been a work in progress. It definitely has a long way to go, but definitely really excited about it. But how was your experience in being at Eyebeam and working with all these different projects? And were there any that really stuck out to you and you're like especially excited about?
Wow, I'm especially excited about all the projects. And I think that's why I really enjoy working, at this role at IB, even just in my like practice as an artist, whatever, I tend to jump from one project to the next because I'm just interested in a lot of things. So I may say, oh yes, I'm going to like pick up from, you know, learning like more about Python,
Mm.
to be like, oh yeah, I want to go back to like my jewelry making design and do my LED based designs. And oh no, my latest project. Okay, I want to listen to like do like a solar panel thing, like that I can operate from my living room and see what happens. What kind of device can I power with that? So all these ideas, they're sort of like stuck somewhere in my head. So being like a project manager to 30 people with 30 great ideas, has been an opportunity to sort of like have a peek into everybody's idea and be a part of everyone's idea, and I think that's why it hasn't been like, for some people in project management, 30 projects is a lot, right? Just because you have to, there are a lot of things that go into project management itself outside of regular management. You really have to look at each project and define, like scopes, and aspects to it. So 30 is a lot when, on that scale. What has made it like I going back to me just being a part of everybody's project, that has been, sort of like, the one thing that has kept me, engaged and just pumping through every day everybody's project. So on that end, I would say I've learned a lot. I've learned a lot about, the different ways people look at art and the different ways people look at, like just regular, um, social ideas, practices, and I've also learned a lot about people as well because, we're in a pandemic. And at the time that rapid response started, we were really just like on a lockdown all over the world. Like nobody could really go out or do anything. And so I had many situations where artists, you know, were eager to speak to me about their projects because they really didn't have a community to speak to or a person, that would spend an hour talking to them about whatever it is they had to talk about concerning their project. So in that way, I also learned a lot about people and a lot about myself. And I would say that, the takeaway for me, is that, you know, this opportunity has provided like another environment, like I'm in school again.
Mm.
And that is, I love learning. So, it's just putting me in a position where I can do more of that.
Yeah. Oh, nice.
I have another question for you. I wanted to sort of hear about the residency that you created over the summer for young Black international creative technologists. Like it, when I heard about it, I was so impressed. And I just kind of want to hear more about like your inspiration and what really like like the people involved and the projects involved and anything that you want to share.
Yeah. Well, the fellowship was something I created out of Africtopia, and it wasn't meant to be for young people. That just ended up being who were just like the rising to the top and had the most exciting ideas. But yeah, it was a really fun process and idea to kind of just come into fruition. And it came about, I probably thought about creating a fellowship for a while, but it felt most fitting in the time that we were in because as soon as March, as soon as like for me, Corona became a thing in March, like I really learned a lot about it then, and hearing about it at that point, I was like, okay, there's definitely going to be no festival. Like I'm not even going to try and wait it out. Like I knew that this thing was going to be something that would last at least a year, maybe a couple of years, maybe even longer. So my idea was more of how can I use this energy to focus on really what's most important about Afrotopia, and that's community. And it's about making sure that people within the community feel supported and that they get to learn about what other people are doing. So, and that we're doing things in a communal form. So the fellowship, I just had a few ideas that I thought could be good spaces to explore for the fellows, like, and it listed them out in the application. So they were designing future cities or designing culturally relevant pedagogy for remote learning amidst poverty, or Afrocentric technoculture, or designing a Black Futures Manifesto. And whoever felt like they like that those kind of ideas meshed well with their spirit would apply. And we had a lot of different people apply from all over the world. And I think I spent maybe a week having conversations from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. every single day with, you know, over 100 applicants. Because for one, I also, even if their application wasn't the most strong, I still just wanted to get to know them and just like allow that door to open so we can have a conversation and understand what are the things that they're thinking. So it was a lot of conversations, and my throat was like dying by the end of the day because I hadn't spent that much talking in a long time. But it was a really, even just the interview process was really beautiful because for one, just being able to talk to people around the world was exciting, and just learning about the things that they're thinking about. But one thing that I found most common with what everyone was saying was they are generally one of the very few people that think the way they do when they're in the environment that they're in. And it could be maybe because they're in an area that's really rural and people just aren't exposed to this stuff, or it could be because what was most often was because they're a student in a predominantly white institution and no one's really thinking about race in the space that they're in. So that was just a common thread that I was hearing. And so in hearing that, and then just being exposed to so many really exciting and talented people, the idea was to just have 5 fellows, and then I couldn't like narrow it down. So it became 10 different fellows. And I'm excited that it was that many because they really created such a special union. Like we would meet every Sunday and have this fellowship, and they just like they it was also about sussing out people's vibe. And I think that's also something I've done with Afrotopia from the beginning. Of in the first festival, it was about I always had a conversation with anyone that would be speaking, because there's a certain kind of, you know, nature that I want to exist in this space as something that's generous and kind spirited. So they all had that, and it was really nice just to see them interact with each other. And with the people that I was having conversations with, I wanted to make sure that even though Afrotopia couldn't fund all of them, they could still create that space that they were looking for. And so we had the fellowship, but we also had the Imaginariums, where that was for anyone that was Black in the public that wanted to join. And so for the fellowship, they had a syllabus, they created a syllabus, and they decided on what projects they wanted to focus on out of that application that I developed, what they wanted to focus on each week, and then created a whole syllabus on these are different readings that we're going to study, these are videos we're going to watch, people we're going to look at, yada, yada. So they had that, and that was online for anyone to access. So the Imaginariums had access to that syllabus, and they would also go through it. And in the Imaginariums on Tuesday evenings, we would have 50 to 60 plus people join, and they would all, for one, be greeted by a guest speaker that was thinking very critically within this space, with whatever prompt we were exploring that day, whether it was pedagogy or architecture. They would present their work, and then I would share the questions that we would be exploring for that time slot, and then they would go off into mini groups, build community with each other. So they're able to have these really intimate conversations with a few different people that they more likely had never met. And then we'll come back together for this collective conversation. And every single conversation, I just left buzzing. I'm just like, wow, like the things that you're thinking about. And sometimes it would be directly in line with the prompt, and sometimes it would be way off tangent, like talking about things that I would never ever hear people talk about in a normal conversation. But it was always really inspiring and mind-opening, and I would just like ruminate on these ideas for the whole week until the next Imaginarium. And I think, and even with the fellowship, that was structured where they had their readings, and then we'd also have a guest speaker come in and talk about their work, a different guest speaker, and they would be exposed to them, and they would be able to have a conversation with them and understand their practice. And then we would vision map and think about and go into our reflections on the readings and vision map on a potential project. And then they would like in an hour at most, they would have time to just prototype a potential idea, which is very little. So I realized like, even though we were spending 5 hours with each other doing all of these different things, it's very little time to actually build something. So the work was very quick prototypes, but I think the essence of the whole fellowship, both in the Imaginariums and in with the Imagineer Fellows, was it's really just creating a space for imagination. Like the goal was not for them to build anything, really like polished or any of that. It was just, let's just imagine, let's document everything that we're thinking about, because these are really important artifacts for anyone to be able to return to and just browse through and see, what was this fellow thinking about in response to this reading. So for me, it was a really inspiring time. And then they the fellowship wrapped up with them giving a presentation. So online, so each fellow presented their work, and we had a bunch of people come into the Zoom and listen to them. And it felt like, so many people said it felt like church, because you're just hearing all these amazing thoughts and everyone's just like hyping them up in the chat. And so another really interesting thing that I've experienced, especially this past summer, is with a lot of different conferences that are happening, is there's so much more energy in virtual conferences, especially when you leave the chat open and just let people talk and say and clap and like do all these things. You just feel so much more energy versus when you're in the same space with someone and everyone's kind of just like sitting there looking at the speaker. So I think that's also just been something really interesting that I want to figure out, how can we mimic that in real spaces. But yeah, they wrapped up with the presentation. They wrapped up with essays, so all of those are online, so anyone can read the fellows' essays, which are a bunch of different reflections on their experience and ideas of going forward. One was by a PhD student, Morgan, who was talking about how before the fellowship, she was feeling very jaded and tired and exhausted of academia and just like this very rigid way that you're allowed to do a PhD and just like to navigate through academia. But in this fellowship, she was able to find so much relevant context that she could realize her work within, and it just like reinvigorated her. And she actually ended up taking an architecture course, because we studied architecture a lot. We also had a few architects that were part of the fellowship, and she took like all these different courses. She started like really be exposed and open herself up to more things, and it just rejuvenated her whole PhD practice. And I think that was just a really, just to like see these little transformations that people had between each other was exciting. And then for me, it was figuring out, okay, well, like we had our fellowship, and then at the end they were like, okay, well, what next? Like, how can we remain in touch? And I'm like, I don't know. Like, that's all, but you have to figure out. So now I've like tried to organize monthly meetups for them, but we still have our WhatsApp group, and we just every now and then we'll just text each other, we miss each other, and we just hope everyone's doing well. And I think it's just really important to foster those kind of communities where you're supportive of each other and you're imagining with each other. I think that's a really intimate and important space to create.
Wow, I agree. I love the whole idea of communal learning. Well, at least that's what I'm calling it in my head. I'm sure you have a different name for it.
Yeah.
It kind of just like reminds me, like when we think about like our ancestors, how like, that whole like storytelling time in the evening, was not just like for children, it was for like the whole village. And it was
Yeah.
really like a knowledge sharing opportunity. And that's like when you think about that, it would make sense that now in 2020, you know, other ways of sharing information just doesn't bring any kind of like spiritual energy to our practice. So when
Yeah.
you go back to like how it was, or like any semblance of that, then learning becomes more interesting, more intuitive, and more purposeful.
Yeah, absolutely. And where is your family from?
Well, my dad is Nigerian,
Mm,
right? And so I lived in Nigeria when I was younger. My mom is Jamaican.
okay.
Yeah,
Oh,
so so both ends, like on the continent and you know
so you
colonial.
lived in Nigeria, right?
I lived in Nigeria for a
Yeah.
while. I was born here in
Mm,
Brooklyn. And
mm.
then when I was really young, we moved to Nigeria, and I stayed there until like I was around 13. My dad passed away, like from
Oh,
personal background, and then so we wanted to move because my mom, was used to life here more than she was used to life over there, being Jamaican. So we moved back, but I went back eventually, and lived there again. Got
yeah.
married and lived there again, and then now I'm
Mm.
back here.
Yeah. And how was learning? Like you spent elementary school in Nigeria.
Elementary and some secondary school. I would say that at the time, at the time that I was in Nigeria, the education system was really good. Not that it isn't good now. So I came here knowing a lot more, not just about, like academic subjects, but also about being Black, and being African and knowing more about like my heritage, So I came here with that sense of purpose, that sort of like guided, has always guided me. I never felt that I didn't know, where I came from. Like I know, where my dad's like town is, and I know everything about that place. I know where his ancestral like family burial ground is, and yeah, and I know my heritage in that way. So for that, I'm grateful, because coming here at such a young age, I didn't have to deal with an identity crisis on that level.
Mm-hmm.
I knew, and I also know, and I knew the potential, that Black people, can, our potential. I never had any question about that.
Yeah.
So that has always helped me be someone that's interested in learning more about everything, and also wanting to learn more about like, being African. Even a lot of my work, as has dealt with like, African technology and, just sort of like finding like a way for African makers to sort of, increase their impact in Africa, especially, and in the world.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Yeah. I mean, what you were saying of just like being able to know your own identity is something that most Black Americans don't have. So that's just so fortunate and important, because I think there is just like this a lot of yearning to understand the African culture and African religions and spirituality and rituals. And we're doing it from books and really not being able to have conversations with people that know it. So yeah, there's just a constant yearn to, because I think when you're able to know your own like geographic roots and study that culture and just like be immersed in that way, you're able to understand yourself so much better. And I was just having a conversation with people where we were talking about being a Black person and just having no understanding of where your family came from, and just like feeling like there's like this big void in understanding your identity. So
I definitely understand that perspective as well. I'd say that, while I was a teenager, you know, years having been disconnected from living in Nigeria, I started to feel that. I started to feel
mm,
like, kind of like loss of hope. And then also like trying to like look at my mom's, like background and her heritage, and, like knowing more about, like my mom, she has like some whites in her, and looking at her, like trying to find out what's like her ancestral background, like what's, where did she come from, knowing more about the white side of her family than the Black side, apart from like my grandmother, was something that I kind of felt like what has been recorded historically in the books is about the white side, not about, the other side, and just feeling that sense of what's missing. Why don't we have that record? Like what happened to it? You
yeah.
know, it's something that can create a sense of loss, and I can definitely relate to that.
Yeah, yeah. So I don't know what we'll do about it. It definitely requires a lot of research and conversations and understandings, but yeah, it's something I think we're all kind of reckoning with constantly, in different forms. But yeah, so what are some things that you are generally excited about within your practice? Like, I don't know if you feel like you're specifically merging culture and your background, like African background, Jamaican background within your work, or maybe more focused on the art or design aspects of it. But how would you define your personal practice, and what are you most excited about?
I would say that most of it, has to do with me, being Nigerian, right? Right now, I'm working on a news website, a news-based website, and I've been working on this project for years. I would say, because I have a background in journalism, And so I've worked in digital journalism for most of my life, right? And so one thing that I've created over again, like I make an iteration and tear it down and make another iteration and tear it down, is this like African news website that calls information, different kinds of information from all over the place, web-based information, data, so it's something that, that I've torn it down like so many times, but now I'm like, let me get it back up. So it's something that is very time consuming, but it gives me pleasure when I see all the information that I'm able to gather, and hopefully next year, this time, I'll have launched it and, we'll be able to take a look and, have a community around that. But
Mhm.
I would say, in my personal practice, that's something that takes up a lot of like my, personal effort, you
Mhm.
know, um, on the like well, technical, but on like the non-cultural side, I love making jewelry. So I've found ways to infuse technology into my jewelry, and so whenever, I have like any spare time, I go back to tinkering with that, and seeing, is there right now I'm trying to figure out if can I make a tiny little PCB to put in a piece of jewelry to do whatever I wanted to do as opposed to all these clunky power sources that I'm figuring out how to embed, in this tiny little lightweight piece of like jewelry. So that's that's really what has been on my mind lately.
Yeah, nice. Do you have any jewelry? Are you wearing any of it?
No, no, I'm not wearing any of it. No, no, no. I have, but I'm not wearing it.
Yeah. Very cool.
Kemi, can we hear how are you bringing technology into jewelry?
That's what I'm that's what I'm figuring out. So
Uh,
what I've done in the past, I've made jewelry that if you move, it lights up, so
mhm,
I've made like earrings and like a body stash, that uses movement as a switch, to sort of like power, up the jewelry and make it light up. And I made that with two concepts in mind. One is accessibility. So, identify with like the disabled community. So, if a person cannot move their body, but they can move their head, then that movement of the head and the light coming up can be a signal to their caregiver, that they need something,
mm,
but I also made it for social purposes. So like a dancer on a dance floor on a stage that wants to sort of like, show their movement through light can use that kind of like, motion based jewelry, for that. When it was exhibited, well, in a showing, a school-based showing, somebody gave me the idea that bicycle riders and people in sports, can use that, especially at night,
mm.
while they're riding their bike. So that's something I'm also exploring as well, because I thought that was a great idea to see how it can be used, in sports technology as well.
Brilliant. Thank you. Can I just jump in? So we're sort of coming to the end a little bit now. It's been really interesting. Thank you, hearing you just like organically talking to each other. But I've got a question about for Ari on your website, where it talks about your interests and work in biomimicry. And I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, that was also part of the project that I was developing with Eyebeam or at Eyebeam in their fellowship. And it's also just a space that I've been looking at for a while, especially in relation to architecture. So with biomimicry, for anyone that doesn't know what that is, it's basically designing systems, things, entities based on the way that biologically or nature generally is structured. So I was thinking about the internet, thinking about the as this more experiential tool. I was also looking at the ways that natural systems have communication threads with each other. So, like trees, was part of my research for the project within the fellowship was reading this book, The Hidden Life of Trees, which I've heard mixed things. Like it's a really beautiful book. It very poetically talks about the experience of trees, but it also is kind of, it's not all rooted in fact. Some of it's a lot more, I think this is happening. And it's like this really famous book. But it generally gives a nice foundational understanding of the ways that trees operate with amongst each other and how they're really in a lot of ways like a similar trees of the same species when they're gathered closer together and like in the woods they can operate very socialist in a socialist kind of form where they share nutrients between each other amongst their roots and make sure that if one is feeling depleted, then they will, pass nutrients on to their way. So they take care of each other in a really interesting way. They also communicate with each other and the surrounding world, where say a deer is eating and nibbling on one of their trees. They understand that that's a threat to their existence and like it's harming them. So they'll disperse this scent that other trees then understand that this animal's eating one of the trees. So then they all spread that scent, and then the deer will actually scent it, and then they'll kind of move off and go to an entirely different species because they understand that this one, like, there's just so many things that are happening amongst them where it's silent communication for us. Like we don't hear any of it, but it's still a communication in the way that we're communicating and sending information across the internet. So I was thinking about that, like what does an internet look like that's biomimicratic, of you have like this seamless way of conducting communication? What does a society look like that's more biomimicratic, of you're taking care of each other, more in like a socialist kind of form? So those were the things that I was thinking. And then when it comes to architecture, I'm constantly thinking about why do we construct houses and buildings that are so oppositional to nature? Like these are the furthest away from organic forms. They're using supplies and materials that are so harmful to the earth. Like, why don't we create with the earth and the way that the earth is structured, and like make these organic forms, and also just use organic materials, use maybe mycelium to fabricate houses or whatever we can. So for me, I'm exploring a lot of biomimicry in different forms, whether it's design practices like building an internet or designing a house or creating a community. Oh, you're muted.
Unbelievably, that's the first time I've done that today, so I've done it well. That's amazing. And the thing that you finished on with like building a community, I don't know if you saw Maxwell had commented in the chat, and he said quite early on and said that he was, really stoked that this is the last session. Communion, in brackets, community, is the key to the question, like, can technology save us? And I think that has really come up in a lot of the conversations that we've had, and especially within this one, because everything that you're talking about is about sharing and that sort of leveling out of of hierarchies and democracy and working with those systems. So I think that is really, it's really pertinent and important to the provocation that Charlene presented.
Yeah, and it was really heartening to hear that that you found doing things in the digital space really kind of nourishing, and all the energy that you felt went behind that. Because I think there's been, the standard line has been since COVID that like we're all more separate, we all feel more disconnected, and we're all much more lonely and depleted. And the fact that everything gets conducted in technology spaces is like partly to blame for that. So I loved hearing this opposite version of that narrative, which is that you found it better in some ways than like in-person interaction. Because I kind of agree with you to some extent. Obviously, I miss people deeply, but I definitely talk to my friends more because I'm just like talking to them more, like especially like from an international perspective. So my friends who are in New York, there's much more discussion, there's much more sharing. So I know at the beginning of this conversation, like Kemi was asking about these lists that you've been kind of going through with the community. I think that happens a lot more than it did before lockdown. This idea of like collective learning doesn't exist in the same way, or not as actively as it does now. So you've given me hope that all you have, that this kind of mode, this kind of mode of operating can potentially be a really amazing thing.
Yeah. And I think it's, I mean, everyone has their own experience. Like there are a lot of external factors that would affect your experience being remote. So definitely sensitive to that. But yeah, I think this is also just a time for us to, like I say, it's a time to be still, though I feel like a lot of our plates have just gotten piled on way more because there's no like stop to the work-life balance. But I think it's generally also just a time where we've needed to just return to ourselves and just like check in with who we are, learn about ourselves, read about, you know, self-knowledge. Like that's a lot of what I've been studying. And now we think we have we think we generally have a good amount of emotional intelligence, but there's so much more for us to learn and understand. And I'm reading a lot of School of Life books, which talks about how yeah, we think that we can understand our brain, but really we can never truly understand ourselves in like a very reasonable way. But I think it's just a constant practice of emotional intelligence, and this time is really forcing us to be very intentional about how are we treating ourselves, what are we thinking about ourselves, what are we thinking about the people that are around us. And I think that definitely affects your remote experience, and also just the design of your space. Like how are you, I think it's been too much of just like on the go and really not taking care of like our space and our environment and in our community in very intentional ways. So now we kind of just have to sit still and really be internal.
And I think hopefully it gives us an opportunity to be more deliberate about how we use technology.
Yeah.
I think before it just felt like a kind of background hum, in that it was something that we did because we were just on our phones, or we were like
Exactly.
we used to have Zoom meetings. I think I've had like 2 video meetings before COVID happened. They
Yeah.
weren't I would do regularly. But now, because it features so heavily in our lives, it's the main way of us contacting people. I personally think a lot more about how I want to use it, what kind of technology I want to use for different kind of conversations.
Mm-hmm.
I like the idea that that's spreading the kind of consciousness.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, to think to the question of like the prompt for this, I think it's, for me, it's personally, it's not like this technology determinism, like tech can save us. But I think it's very much of, is what you were saying, of just like being more deliberate and like critical of understanding technology is purely going to reflect who we are as a group of people. Like that's the only thing it's going to do. It's not, it can never save us. We have to save ourselves first, and then that'll be reflected in the technology that we use. So I think, yeah, just being more deliberate and intentional is important.
I like that at the last line, that we can only save ourselves. It's very true. Okay, I think we're gonna wrap up, Louise. Is that right?
Yes. I mean, I've just got a quick question for Kemi. I was just wondering about the rapid response fellows, and if there's any public outputs from that. Is there going to be any like presentations online or anything that some of our people could get involved with? Is there anything like that?
Well, right now we have the October presentations online. If you guys want to take a look at that to see like the 30 pieces of work, and well, not all 30, because not all artists wanted their videos online, but those who want their videos online, those presentations are online. We're planning something, for February. What that is something that is still in the works, but it is going to be something. We're trying to think outside of the box, so we have different ideas of presentation. So I guess you guys like just have to sort of like sign on to our social media handles, to be in the loop. But we are planning like a publication program for February.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. And thank you so much for spending your Saturday morning with us.
Oh, you're welcome. Anytime.
Thanks for having us.
And so Charlene's going to finish us up now.
I'm going to finish us up. Firstly, I want to just say a huge thank you to everyone who joined today. As we said, it's Saturday. In London, at least, we're on yet another lockdown. I know everyone is in various types of lockdowns across the world. So I do genuinely appreciate people taking the time both to present and to have talks, but also to listen. For me, there's been some really kind of great moments throughout the day. We kind of started with Damara, and Kemi and Ari, you would have been sleeping then. But Damara presented a workshop on how you can mask your face, basically, so that when you're going to protest, surveillance from police can't kind of identify you at a later date. So that if you want to post about that protest to Instagram or anything like that, how could you obscure yourself? And what was, I think, really interesting about that work is not only was she helping us protect ourselves, like how do you protect yourselves from surveillance and some of the damage that can come from that, but she was also highlighting how you could use that protection for further protest. So she, like, with those masks and stuff, you can like use like special filters that talk about what you're protesting about, that are in line with the colors maybe of like the protest, that can use some of the badges and slogans from the protests that you went to. So very different, very opposite to like the Black Squares protest, right? So here you are obscuring something but promoting something else. So I really I love that work on kind of both levels. Following that, we had a conversation with myself and Rashad Newsom, which was, we did that, it was pre-recorded. We did that on Thursday. He's very funny, so I spent most of that conversation laughing, but he's doing really important work. And it relates to some of the conversations we've been having just now about community, and that he's kind of developing AI. Well, one particular piece he's doing is developing AI as a form of therapy. So creating like a robot that acts as a therapist for Black people, both as a response to an older generation of Black people who may not see therapy as something that's accessible to them, and how do you overcome that, but also as a way of widening access just overall. So like doing it in a digital form allowed obviously just for more reach, and for more people to be able to interact with it. So I felt like that work was really important, and I love this idea of technology being used in that really positive way to support and nourish. So that I really loved. Then we had Maxwell. Then we had Gloria, Gloria Lands, and talking to like African artists all about, well, their conversations were about kind of Afrofuturism, but actually then kind of talking about it as Afrofuturism, which again speaks to the conversation you and Kemi were just having about the differences between growing up as part of a diaspora and growing up like in Africa and having that strong connection to Africa, and how much further ahead and connected people felt when they were in Africa, and how they can see their future in some ways much more vividly because they understand their past much better. So that was a super interesting discussion. Then the Maxwell, whose work, all of it was super interesting, but I think this kind of focus on data, and how we can use data to understand our own life better, and then to kind of organize to make the future better, was really important. It obviously relates a lot to the work that Data for Black Lives is doing, which came to mind a lot, and what they've done with COVID, and just kind of organizing different states to kind of deliver numbers so people can understand where it's riding and where local authorities aren't responding in the way they should. Again, how do you support the community with technology and the data that we can gather through it? And then finally, obviously, we've had the two of you. And again, it ended on this note of community, and how our work and our actions will ultimately determine whether or not technology has a positive outcome. And to be honest, that's always what I thought too. The provocation was exactly that. It wasn't that I felt like technology can save us. It can only be ourselves through conversations like this, through interacting with each other in real life. Like, I hope your festival can come back to a physical event, as well as kind of having all the digital aspects. But in real life and through forums like this, and through continuing conversations, that technology can play a significant role in supporting the Black community. That's my hope. I think that's all of our hopes. So yeah, thank you everyone for joining, to help us all along gradually on that journey.